Let's now continue working on the recipe uploading feature. At this time, we will actually work on the model which will be responsible for sending the recipe data to the Forkify API. So let's go to our model, and then down here, after the bookmarks, let's create a new function and export it called upload recipe. Okay, and this one will eventually make a request to the API, and so therefore it's going to be an async function, and it will receive the data for a new recipe. Now, the first task of this function here will be to take the raw input data and transform it into the same format as the data that we also get out of the API. So let's take a look at that. And now it reloaded the page, of course. So basically the format of the data that we receive from the API looks a little bit like this. Now it has some different property names here, but what really matters here is that the ingredients are nicely stored in this array. So there is an ingredients array which contains a bunch of objects where each contains quantity, unit, and description. However, the data that we get into the function right now simply has these three, or actually these six ingredient properties. So ingredient 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And also it has each of these ingredients here separated with these commas all in one string. And so now we need to basically put all of this data here into one array and also separate each of these strings into the quantity, unit, and description. Now, of course, here in the form, I could have also created three different fields for each ingredient. So one input field for the quantity, the unit, and the description. But that was a little bit too much work for this learning project. And so I decided that I will simply give this hint that the format needs to be quantity, comma, unit, comma, description. And so that's what we have here. So half a kilo, so kilo is the unit, and then rice is the description. Then here we need 1 avocado, but there is no unit, and so we leave that one empty. And then here we have just salt, so without any quantity and any unit. And so let's now take this data, so these 6 ingredients, and then take the data out of there and put them into an object. So this is how we will do it. So we want to create an array of ingredients. And so for that, a good idea is to use the map method, right? So map is always good to create new arrays based on some existing data. So in order to use map, we need an array. And so let's convert the object that we get here back to an array. So object.entries. And as I mentioned, this is basically the opposite of object.fromEntries. But it still makes sense to convert it to an object here, because we will also need the rest of the data here as an object. So new recipe, and then we want to filter this array, because remember, we only want the properties that are called ingredient 1, 2, 3, all the way until 6. So in this array that we have right now, each element is an entry, right? And once again, let me actually show that to you. So without seeing the data, I think that it becomes very difficult to follow this. So I will console.log this data here. And now, of course, we need to call this function upload recipe in the controller. So let's not do this, but let's actually call model.upload recipe with the new recipe. Okay, let's click here. And so again, that is our array that we will work with now. And so remember, right now we are filtering this array. And so what we want is basically only the entries where the first element of the array starts with ingredient, like this, right? And then also the second part should not be empty. So in this case, we are of course not interested in 4, 5, 6. Okay. So here in this condition that we need for the filter, we want to say, just as I explained just a second ago, so the first element of the current entry should start with ingredient, and the second one should exist. So it should not be an empty string. So entry 1, so the second element, should not be an empty string. Okay? And so this should now filter out only the data that we are interested in. So let's log that to the console and not this anymore. And yeah, so that is what we were looking for. And now all we need to do is to basically take the data out of the string here and then put that into an object. And so for that, we now finally use the map method. And so here we already have some ingredients. And so now we will take each ingredient and split it by the comma. So that's the separator that I specified. And before we do that, let's actually make sure that we remove any white space here. So we can simply do dot replace. And I believe that right now the replace all method is actually already available. So remember in the video where we talked about strings, I mentioned that replace all will soon be available in browsers. And I believe that right now it already is. And so let's use that here. So let's replace all the basically spaces with an empty string. And so this should then return an array of 3 elements. And so let's now destruct that array. So the first element is the quantity, the second one is the unit, and the third one is the description. And now let's return an object with this. So with quantity, unit, and description. Now we will still have to do some things here, but for now let's take a look at what we get. And ingredient.replaceAll is not a function. So now that's because each ingredient here is actually still an array. So just like we had it here before in the entry. So the first element of entry here, remember, was the key, and the second one was the value itself. So here we need to use this on ingredient 1. So the second element of the entry. So let's see now. And here we go. So we have quantity, unit, and description nicely inside of one array. And so that now kind of looks like this. Great. Now there's just one thing that we need to notice here, which is that when the quantity does not exist, then we want it to be null. And otherwise, it's actually a number. So currently we still have strings here, but we want this to be a number now. And so let's go ahead and convert that. So let's come here. So the quantity should be, so if there is a quantity, so let's use the ternary operator. So if there is a quantity, then convert that to a number. All right. And if not, which is the situation in which it is an empty string, then we want to return null. So that should fix that. And indeed, it does. But now let's see what happens when we simply put something else here. Let's say just a number. So let's see. Well, then here we get a bunch of undefineds. And so that we don't want. So our format here should always contain quantity, comma, unit, comma, description. So in this case, what we would need to do is this. So this is what we would expect. And so then we get here the empty strings as expected. So basically what this means is that when we split this string here, we want it to have 3 parts. All right. And so let's actually convert that to our code. So here we want to now put this here into a separate variable. So let's call it ingredients array. And then that is the array that we destructure. But before we do that, we can test if this array actually has the length of 3. So if ing array.length is different from 3, then we want to create a new error. So throw new error, and then let's say wrong ingredient format. Please use the correct format. And so then at this point here, the function will immediately exit. Now, then what do we want to actually happen with this error? Well, we will want to render an error message to this view. So to the add recipe view, right? And that is very simple. So here we can use or try catch just like we have been doing before. So try. And so if some error occurs in this function here, then it goes to the catch block as always. So here we get the error. And then let's log that error to the console. Again, with some emojis here to make it easy to understand that it is our own error. And then we can simply say add recipe view dot render error. And now we can actually pass in the error message ourselves, because here in the view, we accounted for that ability. So by default, the error message is coming from this .error message, but we can also specify our own. And so that is what we will do now, because this way we are able to create the error message basically here where the error actually occurred. Okay, so error dot message. And so now let's see what happens. So for now, let's use the correct format just to see if everything keeps working. And it does. But now let's do it wrong. And we get wrong ingredient format, but it is still coming from the model. So here we get uncaught in promise. And that actually makes sense, because remember that here we are in an async function already. So this returns a promise, and so basically this then rejects the promise. And so therefore we should handle that already right here. So try like this, and then catch the error and simply throw that error again. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, and that still doesn't look the way we want it to look. So we want it here to be an error message. And so that should come from the controller. And so that means that there is something wrong in the controller. And I guess I know why that happens, because remember that this is an async function right here. So it returns a promise, but then right here, we are actually not awaiting that promise. So we need to use await here and then also make this an async function. And so only with this, we are now actually handling this function here as a function that returns a promise, so that the rejected promise can then actually get caught here in this catch block. So let's try once again here with some number. And now it works. So now we get the actual error with this emoji mark and also the error that we want here. Okay, great. So we have that part working of the ingredients. Now it's time to actually create the object that is ready to be uploaded. So let's create a recipe object here. And so basically this object will be the opposite of this one here. So here we take in like the source URL formatted as this, and we want to send the data where the URL looks like this. So where the property has this format. It's the same here for the URL and the cooking time actually, because that is exactly the format that the API is ready to receive. So it has to be exactly the way that we received it. Okay, so let's write that object very quick. So that is at new recipe.title. Then the source URL is at new recipe.source URL like this. Then the image URL is new recipe.image, right? Then the publisher is actually the same. .publisher. The cooking time, new recipe.cooking time. So fortunately, VS Code is giving us already the correct suggestions. .servings. And so that's all, I think. And so all we have to do now is to add the ingredients array. And that's it. And then we also have two numbers here, which we should convert to numbers using this plus trick. All right. And so now let's actually log this one to the console and not just the ingredients. Oh, and of course, all this should be happening inside of this try block, right? So let's see. Okay, that looks great, and it looks ready to be actually sent to our API. Okay, so let's do that. So remember, we already have a method for getting JSON. So that's this one. And now let's create a method for sending JSON here in our helper. And actually, it's going to be very similar. So for now, let's just copy it. But then a bit later, we will simply refactor this. So here, let's call it send JSON. All right. And so now let's learn how we can actually send data using the fetch function. So up until this point, all we ever did was to simply pass in a URL into the fetch function, and that would then automatically create a GET request. However, to send data, remember how we discussed before that needs to be a POST request. And so here, besides passing in the URL, we also need to pass in an object of some options. Okay, and the first option is going to be the method. And so that method is now post. Then we also need to pass in an object of headers. And headers are basically some snippets of text which are like information about the request itself. And many of them are like standard headers. And one that we need to define is the content type. So content type with an uppercase C and a T. So make sure you get that right. And then here, application /JSON. And so with this, we tell the API, so we specify in the request that the data that we're going to send is going to be in the JSON format. And so only then our API can correctly accept that data and create a new recipe in the database. And now finally, the payload of the request. So basically the data that we want to send, which is called the body. So the body should be in JSON, remember, as I just explained. And so we can once again use json.stringify and then convert the data that we want to send. Now, and here we actually need to accept that data here into the function, of course, as a second parameter. So let's call that upload data. And so that is the data that we then convert to JSON so that it can be sent. And that's actually it. So that's all we need to do. So we still pass in a URL, which we will need to specify next. And then we take that URL and the upload data and then simply create this fetch request like this. Okay? And then everything else is actually going to be the same. So we will still have this request racing about a timeout function so that it can't run forever. And we will also await any data coming back because this API that we're going to use, so the Forkify API, will actually return the data back that we just sent. And you will see in a moment why that is very important. Okay? So again, everything here is going to be the same. And so a bit later, we will then refactor these two here into the same function. But let's do that later. So here we now need to import the send JSON function. And so now let's use our newly created function to create the AJAX request. So send JSON, and now the URL of the API. And actually, we have that here stored somewhere. So that's this URL that we have in the config, right? So /recipes, but that's actually not all, as we will see in a second. All right, let's get rid of this. And now let's go to the Forkify documentation page. So at this URL, because now we actually need the API key. So please click here now on this button, which will then generate your unique developer key. Now, if you got some kind of error here while generating your key, then maybe it is because you requested more than one API keys per hour. So remember that you should only ever request one API key. That's why I have this limit here in place, so that no one can abuse my API, basically. Now, if you did actually only try it once and you still got an error, then you can always contact me on Twitter. Okay, so here's the link to my Twitter page, and then just tweet the error at me, and I will try to help you. Now my key disappeared here, so let's click here again. And now I will copy it so that I can use it in my code. So let's go down here, or actually it's right here. So you see the API path is actually exactly the same as for getting all the recipes. Now the only difference is that, of course, we will not search for anything now, but we will have to add our key like this. So with this key parameter. Okay, and so yeah, we are doing a post request now, right? And so that creates a new recipe then when we hit this endpoint, so this path with a post request and some data. Okay, now let's store actually this key in the config file. So as a string. Okay, and then let's use that key here. So again, the question mark to specify a list of parameters, and then key equals, and then we have to import it up here. And then the key. Okay. And remember that this will actually send the recipe then back to us. And so let's store that as data. And also await it. And then finally, let's log that data to the console. So console.log data. And now let's see what happens. So we got a lot of errors here. So it seems like the data is completely wrong. And that's simply because I just forgot to actually put that data here. So the recipe. So of course, send.json has two parameters. So not only the URL, but also the data. Let's try that again. And it kind of worked already, because this error that we got back here is actually already an error coming from our API. So it tells us that the input data is invalid because the source URL needs to be at least 5 characters long. So let's try that again. Oh, and actually we need to reload for now. So the URL, let's just add something here, and probably all of them need this. So let's do that quickly here in the HTML, so as the default value, kind of. So you see now we have test 23, and as we upload it now, then that worked. So we get a status success back from our server and then our data, right? So that data contains everything that we just sent it, plus the created at and also an ID, and of course, also your key. And that key will be very important in the next video when we then want to mark our own recipes, basically as our own. Now, it will make sense to actually render this newly created recipe also then to the user interface after closing this display here. So after closing this window, right? And so therefore, we need to convert that to the format that we use in our application, right? So basically, in our application, we are using these different like property names, right? So we are in the same situation as we are here in load recipe, where we get the data in the original format. So with this kind of property names, and we now need to convert it back to this one so that our application understands the data. All right. Now, instead of writing this entire code here twice, we can simply grab this and put it into a new function. So let's do that right here and call that one create recipe object. And it simply receives some data, and then it returns an object like this. So return this, so that then we can do whatever we want with it. And in this case, that's going to be to put that in the state. So state.recipe will be create recipe object with the data that we receive. So basically just some nice refactoring. So this now does exactly what we had before, but now we can use that down here as well. So we get the data, and now we want to then store that into the state. So again, state.recipe equals create recipe object with the data that we just received. And now let's actually come here to the controller and log that state.recipe to the console. So that's model.state.recipe. Okay. So let's see. And yeah, it now looks exactly the same as this one. Right? So beautiful. There's just one thing missing, which is this bookmarked here, and also the key is missing as well. So let's take care of the bookmarking and also of preserving our API key in this object. Okay, and a quick look at our flowchart here will reveal that all we want to do is basically store the bookmarks to local storage, right? And also mark, of course, that recipe as a bookmark. Okay, so we already implemented most of this. So this and this in the last lecture, then this part and this part in this lecture. But let's now also take care of bookmarking it. But that is very easy because we already have the function for that. So that is, of course, add bookmark. So we already have our recipe, and so we can simply call add bookmark with our recipe, and that will then take care of everything. So add bookmark with state.recipe. And finally, we also need to add our key to the object, so to state.recipe. And we could do that here manually, but let's actually use a nice trick to do that down here or up here where the object is actually created. So right here. Now, in the case of a load recipe, not always there will be a key. So most of the recipes, of course, don't have any key. And so we cannot simply do this. So key recipe dot key, because again, not all of them will have one. So we only want to add the key if there actually exists one. So let's use a nice trick to do that. So we can use the AND operator, which does short circuiting. So we can do recipe dot key and then this object. All right. And I will explain to you in a second what this does. And then we can spread this. So that looks confusing. So let me explain what is happening here. So remember that the AND operator short circuits. So if recipe.key is a falsy value, so if it doesn't exist, well then nothing happens here, right? And so then the destructuring here, well, does basically nothing. Now, if this actually is some value, then the second part of the operator is executed and returned. And so in that case, it is this object here basically that is going to be returned. And so then this whole expression will become that object. And so then we can spread that object to basically put the values here. And so that will then be the same as if the values would be out here like this. Key recipe.key. But again, only in case that the key actually does exist. And so this is a very nice trick to conditionally add properties to an object. So keep this one in mind. It is a very handy trick sometimes. Okay, and I think we should actually be done here now. So you see, uploading data is a lot of work. But I think this is still a nice exercise. And let's see, here is our key now. And also the recipe is now bookmarked. Great. So just to finish this lecture very quickly, let's go back to the controller and now actually render this recipe in the recipe view. So render recipe, which will be recipe view dot render, and then as always model.state dot recipe. But now with this we would not really be able to see that rendered recipe yet because we still have that form open. So let's now close that form. So close form window. And we can do that because there is already a method for that here. So it's this public toggle window method. And so let's now use that. Okay. So, and actually let's not do that immediately, but only after some time, so that we can first display a nice success message. So we can use a set timeout. And then inside of that callback function, we can then call add recipe view dot toggle window. And here let's specify some time, let's say 2.5 seconds. However, as you already know, we should never use a magic number like this. So let's create one more configuration variable here. Let's call this the modal close, and then let's say seconds, so that we know that this value is actually a value in seconds. So let's use 2.5. And now we need to actually import this, because I believe that right now we are not yet importing this into the controller. And indeed, we're not. So let's say then the named import from config.js. And so then down here, let's use that modal close seconds and then times 1,000 to convert it to milliseconds. Okay. And before we do that, let's also display a success message. And for that, we already have in our view the render message method, right? Which will take this .message, which in this case, we don't have one yet, but let's actually add one. Recipe was successfully uploaded. And so now it's very, very easy to do this. All we have to do is add recipe view dot render message. And so once again, now that we have all of these nice methods in place, it's very easy to take data and then render all kinds of things on the user interface. For example, like this error or the success message, or of course, the data itself. So let's try one more time. And there is our success message, and it also disappeared. And great, here is our recipe. And also with our nicely formatted ingredients. So remember, we put 0.5 kilos of rice, and so of course that was successfully converted to 1/2. And you see it's also already a bookmark. So you see that it's right here. Of course, there's no image because that path that I specified there is of course not a correct path, but that doesn't matter at all here. And now to really finish, let's now add just one final thing, which is to render like a loading spinner in the add recipe view before we actually start to upload the data. So this will then show the user that something is happening. And so one more time, that is now really easy to do, because we already have all these methods in place. Okay, let's slow down our network a little bit to slow 3G so that we can actually see it happening. Well, that didn't display the spinner for some reason there. So let's see. Add recipe view dot render spinner looks pretty correct to me. So let's just take out this piece here so that we can actually inspect the code. Oh, and now it's taking more time because we are. So let's put it back online. Add recipe. Oh, and now you see it actually showed the loading spinner. So not sure what happened there, but now it is all good. Okay, great. So all we have left to do now is to then display this recipe as our own, basically by using the key that we have now here in our object, and also do the same thing in the search. So let's take maybe a quick break and then come back to finally finish this application.